Good evening, everyone. As Diane said, thank you very much for braving the weather or the winter that won't end to join us tonight. We're very honored. For myself and my good friend Stu Stanek, this is our first collaboration together. We've had a lot of fun and we've learned a lot. We're going to share that with you tonight. I had fun, Stu Meister. I hope you did. So it's been a pleasure working with you. A couple caveats before we forget. Those Stu's lived in Park City for over 30 years, and I will soon have lived here for 30 years. We didn't grow up here, and we also didn't grow up in Ketchum, Idaho, the two towns that we are talking about today. We've been time traveling. The time frame for this lecture is from April 12th, 1861 to December 21st, 1963. Time travel is an inexact science, as it should be. So if there's any things that we say tonight that you can improve upon or correct, we'll have a Q&A period starting at 6 o'clock. We promised Diane that we would be done by 6 o'clock, and we're going to jam it in and make sure that happens. Okay. Before we start, or before we run out of time, we wanted to get some thank yous and appreciations over with before. The inspiration for this lecture came from Keith Drosy. For those of you who don't know him, he was the general manager of the Mayflower Mine from 1961 to 1966. He currently lives in Globe, Arizona. In November of last year, I went to see him in Globe, Arizona, and we took lunch together. In the time I've known Keith, which is a very long time, he always raved about working at Sun Valley, which he did from 1951 to 1955 on his winter breaks and summer breaks from college. And some of the things that he always made it a point of saying, they provided free transportation via the Union Pacific Railroad. The resort was owned by the Union Pacific Railroad. They provided free room, free board, and wonderful uniforms, including laundry service. And Keith has a deep fondness for Sun Valley and the atmosphere there. So I want to thank Keith for providing the inspiration for this. Peggy Fletcher, I can't thank you enough for your kindness in sharing your history with Mel Fletcher. So you've been wonderful. Thank you very much. Dalton Gackle, though he's not here, a terrific gentleman. Many of the images that we use in tonight's lecture, Dalton retrieved for us from the museum archives. Jim Hewitson, a fourth generation Park City person. He is not here. I will mention him a little bit later in the lecture, but he carried on a family tradition that he and I authored a series of articles on. His grandfather worked in the mines, his father, and 4 of his 6 siblings. And so he was the youngest of 6, and he too worked as an engineer for United Park City Mines. Diane, of course, thank you for allowing us to give this lecture tonight. Steve Latham, a good friend of mine, also a 4th generation Park City person. Anytime I'm talking about the town or its history, he's one of the first people I reach out to because I would be mortified if I said anything that he didn't agree with. Connie Nelson from the Althingen Museum, she was very helpful to us. Also, Terry Olivia from the Ketchum Regional Museum. She was contributed mightily to our research. And Larry Warren, though he's not here tonight, a noted local journalist and newsman, and also author. You may be familiar with his book, Mountain of Treasure. It's a wonderful history of Park City. And for myself, I consider it one of my go-to references when I'm beginning any research on any topic in Park City. Keith, you know, on the left, young Keith Drosy, the summer of 1951, his first time working at Sun Valley. And the picture on the right is an older Keith Drosy and one of our many hikes to the B-18 crash site. So Keith, thank you for your inspiration for the lecture tonight. And no problem. All right. Ketchum, Idaho, and Park City, Utah, or Sun Valley are world-renowned ski resorts and ski towns. But our quest tonight is to understand, how did that happen? Okay. Our tale tonight is going to involve 2 US presidents, an insurrection, a host of visionary leaders, and a Nazi. All right. Our discussion is going to actually begin on April 12th, 1861, when the Fort Sumter was unprovokedly attacked, kicking off the Civil War. Over the course of the next 6 to 7 months, 13 states would secede from the Union and form the Confederate States of America. We all know Abraham Lincoln, considered one of our greatest presidents, and Jefferson Davis was president of the Confederate States of America. And we have a picture of Fort Sumter. In any action, small or large, there always are unintended consequences. Next. For the Progressive Republican Party, which was formed in the early 1850s, they had a very clear vision for what they wanted the country to become. First of all, they wanted the East and West Coasts linked together by iron rails. They wanted to abolish slavery. They wanted to give a reason for people to relocate to the western part of the United States. They wanted an educated workforce, and they wanted the main driver of the economy at the time, agriculture, to be science-based. In 1862, once the bickering partisan Southern Democrats had left the upper and lower chambers, the Republican Party could pass whatever they wanted. And they passed this legislation. This legislation would ultimately set the United States on a course to become the global superpower that it is today. It's interesting to note that those programs were not available to anybody who took up arms against the United States, i.e. the southern states. So that program was really designed, or those programs, as punishment for those states that succeeded from the Union. Mining at the forefront. Sally, this slide's for you, Patrick Connor. There's always a debate about who was the father of mining in Utah. I would say that there's multiple fathers. I just happen to know this gentleman better than I know Ephraim Hanks, so please. Anyway, both the Wood River Valley in Idaho and the Wasatch Mountains became mining communities. And they were only able to do that because of the railroad. The first transcontinental railroad came through Echo, Utah in April of 1869. And by 1980, rails had been laid into Park City by the Union Pacific Railroad. And by 1884, rails had been laid into Ketchum, Idaho. And once the rails arrived, mining flourished. Both mining districts were known for their silver, lead, and zinc production. In the case of the Wood River Valley, the early prospectors, where you can read their names, David Ketchum, who the town is named after. Ketchum was originally named Leadville when the post office was established in 1880 there. And the US Postal Service determined that there were too many towns in the West named Leadville. So they arbitrarily changed it to Ketchum because he was one of the first people to stay there. David Ketchum was, I don't want to say a sketchy person, but he was a kind of a mysterious person. He didn't stay in the town named after him very long, and there are no known images of him, whether photographs or sketchings. And after he left Ketchum, having been there 3 years, nobody knows what happened to him. So he's kind of a mystery man. Okay, the role of the railroads can't be emphasized enough in the settlement of the West and the development of both Park City and Ketchum. And I'm a simple person, and I always try to come up with a unit of measure to convey something like the magnitude of it. Before 1869, we have this famous photo from Promontory, Utah, the celebration of driving the Golden Spike and united the East and West Coast together by iron rails. Before that event, if you wanted to go across the country either way, it took 6 months, 180 days. It was expensive, it was death-defying, and it didn't matter which route, which of the three routes you took, it was no good. 6 months, 180 days. After the railroad, 6 days. So from a unit of measure, if you want to get an idea of the impact that this would have on the development of the West and our country, just consider 180 to 6. So for me, that is kind of conveys the magnitude of change that we're talking about. The railroads led to prosperity. I'm sure there are those in the audience that know what this parade is, but it conveys prosperity. And we have the Ontario Mill. It's 3 great smokestacks, belching smoke, which today we might not like, but back then it was a sign of money and prosperity. So nobody complained about those type of activities. While Park City had hundreds of mines at that time, so did the Wood River mining district in Wood River Valley in Idaho. Good times don't last forever. In 1893, the silver panic touched off the worst economic calamity of the 19th century. And that calamity would lead to a deep depression, which would persist until 1897. For the mining industry in Ketchum, the reality was by the early 1890s, it had started to become difficult. The availability of ore became more difficult to get to. They had to dig deeper, which increased the cost. And the quality of the ore also declined. So the silver panic for Ketchum basically knocked out mining there as a primary driver for the economy. And from a period of time from 1893 until 1895, the population of Ketchum fell from 2,500 to less than 300. The mining just, for all intents and purposes, went away. Park City, on the other hand, enjoyed much greater mineral reserves. And they also had a very collaborative environment between the mine workers and the mine owners. And the mine workers banded together and agreed to take a 50% cut in pay in return for guaranteed employment. And that allowed the mining industry here to survive the next 4 years. And when the Depression was over, Park City continued on its path to enjoy prosperity from mining. I was talking with some of the guests here tonight about the Harriman family. As a result of the Depression, from 1893 to 1897, 1/3 of all railroads in the United States entered receivership or bankruptcy, including the Union Pacific Railroad. Edward Henry Harriman, the gentleman on the left, the father of Averell Harriman, came from a scrappy background. His education ended at 14 years old, and he was on his own. By age 21, he was a multimillionaire and a stockbroker on Wall Street. And he was known as a brilliant financier, money manipulator, financial engineering. And he and a group of investors in 1897 bought the Union Pacific out of bankruptcy for dimes on the dollar. And basically set the Union Pacific on a path that would be continued by his son, where today it remains one of the premier transportation companies in the United States. Averell Harriman was the oldest of the 4 Harriman children. And he was expected, as all the Harrimans were, to find their own way and not be dependent upon the family wealth. And as we'll talk about Averell Harriman, he went on to have a brilliant business career, a brilliant technology career, and a brilliant political career that would span up until he passed away at age 94. Brown Brothers and Harriman. Matil, you may know the Brown Brothers. Averell and his younger brother, Edward Rowland, formed 2 banks in the 1920s. And in 1930, they merged them with a private banking firm called Brown and Brown. That firm had been established by the Brown brothers in 1818. And today, Brown Brothers Harriman remains the largest private banking firm in the country, located at 140 Broad Street in New York City. All right, it's all about selling train tickets. and getting people to ride the trains. Union Pacific Railroad, under the leadership of the Harrimans, was one of the first railroad companies to develop destination ski resorts. And one of the things that I learned, shockingly, their first resort was Garfield Beach on the Great Salt Lake, which was developed in the 1890s. Hold on, let me look at my notes here, sorry. Thereafter, in quick succession, under the leadership of the Harrimans, Union Pacific would open destination resorts in Yellowstone, Bryce Canyon, Zion, Death Valley, and the Grand Canyon, and one more that we're going to talk about in a little bit. So they were the pioneers of these destination resorts. People who traveled back then tended to be wealthy, and they would stay for extended period of times and lavish the Union Pacific Railroad with their money. Next. Start of a friendship. In 1930, a wealthy Austrian royal family dispatched their 28-year-old son to New York City to learn the ways of international finance and banking. Coincidentally, his clerkship would be at Brown and Harriman. And though there was a 14-year age difference between Averill and Count Felix von Schuschkatsch, is that? I know my German teacher just is giving me an F minus, but you know, I cannot pronounce the good Count's last name, so I'm just going to call him the Count or Count Felix. But they were both members of privilege, though in Averill's case, he was not bound by his privilege. And they developed a fast friendship. The Count was flamboyant. He spoke 5 languages fluently. He was handsome. He was charming, and he was a sportsman, in particular known for his skiing. And he regaled Averill with these luxury resorts in Europe and how wealthy people went to them and spent, you know, weeks at a time, and they rode luxury trains. Now, keep in mind, he's starting his clerkship in 1930. The Depression is really starting to grind down on not only the Union Pacific Railroad, but the country in general. Excuse me. From 1920 to 1932, Union Pacific would see its passenger business decline by 60%. Averill Harriman, as instilled by his father, was a fighter. And he was not willing to stand back and let this happen. You know, he's a scrappy guy. So he started concocting in his mind. He wanted a new destination resort, and he was going to build super trains, unlike anybody had ever seen, to bring them there. All right, we already started to talk about the Great Depression and its impact on the railroad business. And Averill already thinking of how he's going to try to strike back and regain some of his passenger business. 1932, Averill becomes chairman of the board of Union Pacific Railroad. The picture on the left is a young Averill, his freshman year at Yale. One thing I want to mention, his dad, Averill entered Yale in 1909, September of 1909. In the first week of September that year, his father died at 61 years old, unexpectedly so, leaving a fortune of $100 million, which in today's dollars would be approximately $3.5 billion. And before his father died, Averill was enrolled in a program, a kind of a mentorship that his father had set up, that over the next few years, every summer, he would work in a different department of the Union Pacific Railroad. His first assignment that summer after he graduated high school and before entering Yale, he was an axeman, what the term was. He cleared brush, coincidentally, on the Oregon shoreline. And his father made sure that he was not only cut no slack, but I guess you would call it hazing, that people really took a toll on him to push him. He got no consideration for being the owner of the company's son, quite the contrary. But over the next 5 years, he would work in every major department in the Union Pacific Railroad, surveying, the mechanical department, purchasing, and finance. So by the time he graduated from Yale and went to work for the Union Pacific Railroad, he would be intimately familiar with all aspects of the railroad. We mentioned that he had a career in politics and international banking. The picture on the right, is that right? He's with Joseph Stalin. Averell Harriman was one of the first American businessmen to do business with the Soviet Union. And as such, in 1942, Franklin Roosevelt named him ambassador to the Soviet Union. In 1946, he would also be named ambassador to the United Kingdom. So we just happen to like this picture because Averell's got a beaming face between two world figures. Getting back to our friend whose last name I could pronounce, the good Count. The premier ski resorts of Europe, two of which are listed here, and there's others, they actually began their existence in approximately the 1860s and 1870s. They were not destination ski resorts. They were health spas for the wealthy. People would go there for dietary reasons, health reasons, indulge in the warm baths and the spas and hiking to become healthy. But by the 1920s, skiing had been introduced and it was well established. And for Averell, on his business trips to Europe, he began to realize that a lot of the folks that he dealt with would be at these resorts, not at the French Riviera, but they would go to them year round. And again, getting back to the Count's influence on him, he began to think, yeah, maybe one of these resorts could help me revive my passenger business. I just want to mention that the Count's clerkship or internship was finished in 1931. And he sailed back to Austria to go into the family's banking business. The Count and Averell Harriman continued to have a relationship. And frequently when Averell went over to Europe, he would stay at the family compound in one of the many houses they had on it. So the friendship continued and continued to expand. Next. In one of their meetings, the Count was so sure about the benefit of and the economic benefit of building a luxury resort, he encouraged Averell, build it and then we'll come. And so Averell decided to go for it. He went to the board of directors and asked for an investment of $350,000, a staggering sum in the depths of the Great Depression, to build a luxury destination ski resort equal to or greater than any of the best in Europe. And he was also going to develop a class of super trains to take wealthy people there. And again, you know, for the very, very wealthy, such events as depressions really had no impact on them. In November of 1935, the Count sailed to New York to meet with Averell. Their business agreement was such that during this period of research, the Union Pacific Railway would pay for the Count's expenses, only first class, and that the Count would donate his time. In November of that year, 1935, they came up with a list of criteria, and that would include wherever they went, it had to have sun. It had to have mountains, but not too steep. Somebody was just saying in here that the mountains in Sun Valley are not particularly steep. They needed snow, and they needed a dry climate, so the snow would be fluffy. The term we would use nowadays would be Sierra cement. And, you know, in the case of the Count, he was saying for wealthy people, you want to make it as easy as possible for them to ski. And of course, it had to be close to a Union Pacific main line. And also it had to be remote. So people had to take the new trains to get there. Just before we move on, the Count would leave New York beginning his 6-week, 7,000-mile journey to find skiing Shangri-La in the continent. And he would go to, these are not in any particular order, Mount Rainier, Jackson, Wyoming, Aspen, Colorado, Alta, Brighton, and Park City, and Ketchum, Idaho. Okay, the Count comes to the Wasatch back the second week in January. His host at Alta and Brighton is the famed Norwegian import, Alf Engen. already a world-class ski jumper, but Alf Engen was adept at all forms of skiing. And they spent several days together exploring the Alta and Brighton area, and also are rumored to have skied over into what would become the Park City ski resort. In reading private correspondence about his experience with the Count, I don't know if these are complimentary or not, but Alf described him as somebody who wore his title well, and also was accomplished in alpine skiing. And I don't think that was such a compliment either. But neither here nor there, the next stop after visiting Alta and Brighton was Park City. And his host in Park City was none other than a junior in Park City High School, Mel Fletcher. Mel Fletcher in 1936 was already a legendary athlete in Park City. He jumped competitively with the Engen brothers, and his passion and love for Park City and his vision of the future for a ski-based industry were already well established. So he was naturally the person that was selected to give the Count a tour of Park City. Now, there was no skiing here yet. There was some ski jumping, but there was really no skiing. But as we will learn, there was a lot of press about a new area that was going to be developed called Snow Park. And just before we leave this slide, we have Mel over on the left with his 1924 Buick. It's all chained up so he can take the Count around, and it was painted red, white, and blue. Next. All right. Sorry. After Park City, he goes to Ketchum, Idaho. And Ketchum now has 270 people living there. It's primarily a ranching community. And the Count tours around. And keep in mind, you want to ski down back then, you got to hike up. So you got to be in phenomenal shape. So after a day of exploring the area, the Count just has this intuitive feeling, this can be the place. And so he is rumored to have uttered a phrase that was originally mentioned by a famous person in Utah in 1847, and that was, "This is the place." So he wired Averill and said he had found the place, and Averill quickly came to Ketchum, Idaho, and being a man of decision and a man who had access to unlimited financial resources, within a week, the Averill Harriman purchased 4,000 acres from the Bass family that would form the resort to be named Sun Valley. Okay, May 1936, ground is broken. They are going to build the St. Moritz of North America. And for Averill, he wanted it to be not just equal to, but better than the best resorts in Europe. And again, money was going to be no object. And we'll soon find out how much it ultimately cost him to build this thing. Next. This gentleman, Steve Hannigan, I never heard of him. This is another thing that we learned. Steve Hannigan was a marketing genius and promotional genius. He began plying his trade in 1920 by naming or coining a name for what became the most secret fraternal organization in the country. So secret, I can't even say the name. But anyway, Averill hires Steve Hannigan to help him market and kind of figure out how to make this luxury resort. You can read all about Steve Hannigan's accomplishments there. Politically, he moved seamlessly between the Republican and Democratic Party, helping them with their respective campaigns. He developed the marketing programs for Coca-Cola, for Miami Beach, for Las Vegas, for the Indianapolis 500, and he was a broker to Hollywood's elite. Where the Count said, "Build it and they will come," Steve Hannigan said, "Advertise it and they will come." And advertise it, he did. He developed a nationwide program, to promote this resort. A couple things that he did. He named it Sun Valley. And the tagline for that was, "Winter sports under a summer sun." And he tried to convey to Averill, you're going to be appealing to wealthy people, okay? You don't want just skiing, because a lot of them will have never skied before. So under Hannigan's direction, he convinced Averill to build swimming pools, mineral swimming, hot springs up there, a skating rink. He also, when Averill was talking about his vision for things, he goes, well, how are you going to get these people up to the top of the mountain in case they don't know how to ski? Averill said, didn't think about that. Hannigan said, you better think about it. And so the first chairlift in the world was developed and deployed at Sun Valley, Idaho. And the designer of that chairlift was a gentleman from the Union Pacific Engineering Department named Jim Curran, C-U-R-R-A-N. And he had developed conveyor systems to load and offload bananas into the Union Pacific shipping fleet. So he basically adopted the design of the conveyor system to move bananas, to move people. And when all was said and done, the final price tag for phase one of this resort was $1.5 million. In today's dollars, that would represent close to $350 million. That is still a staggering sum by today's standards, at least I think. Next. All right, super trains. I know Diane, don't be fretting about the time, I'll be quick. The Union Pacific Railroad was the first railroad company to really apply the internal combustion engine and the latest advances in technology to intercity passenger trains. We have the M1000 here, which was the first train of its type in the history of the United States, or rail transportation here. And it, in its own self, became an event. It shattered speed records, and wherever it went, thousands of people flocked to it. So, Averill knows he's onto something here. And for those that didn't have their own private Pullman cars, they could ride these super trains to Shoshone, Idaho, and take a luxury motor coach, also developed by the Union Pacific Railroad, to Sun Valley, Idaho. And here we have a picture of two of their luxury motor coaches, of course, painted in the colors associated with Union Pacific's passenger trains. A magnet for the rich and famous. You got to love this photo. And there we have the chairlift that Steve Hannigan and Jim Curran had so much to do with. And of course, it was the place to be and the place to be seen. The first year of operation, 4,000 people flocked to the resort. It became an international sensation and an international destination. They're happy. The Count and Averill, beaming smile here, 1937. However, unfortunately for the Count, he had an infection that would ruin the relationship between the two men. Next. Yes, the Count was a Nazi, and he fully drank the Kool-Aid offered by Hitler and the Nazi Party. Coincidentally, when Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the Count was in the United States and had a conversation with Averill, and Averill offered him the opportunity to remain in the United States for the duration of the war. The Count declined. It said it was his duty to go back, and he did. He enlisted in the SS, certainly no Boy Scouts, and into one of their Wehrmacht divisions, which was a motorized division. He was killed in action in August 1942 on the Russian front, the same country where his once benefactor was now the ambassador. Meanwhile, in Park City, certainly the town's dependency solely on mining really got clobbered hard by the Depression. Prices collapsed, demand collapsed. The town's population declined by 50% from 1930 to 1940. And something had to be done. Summit County, Park City, Ogden, and Salt Lake City all banded together to submit a proposal to the Works Progress Administration, one of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal entities, to request a federal investment in Park City for a winter snow park that would encourage people to visit Park City. In December of 1935, the WPA announced a $15,000 commitment to build a snow park in Park City. The location chosen was Deer Valley at the throat of Frog Valley, just by the Park City Consolidated Mine. Whereas the Count and Averill wanted nothing to do with day trippers. Day trippers was what everybody wanted. And Park City was selected because they had a robust transportation infrastructure. They were served by two Class I railroads, the Denver, Western, and Rio Grande from Salt Lake City, the Union Pacific Railroad from Ogden, and they had an existing road network. So this is perfect. We're going to get day trippers, and we want day trippers. I love this photo. Peggy, thank you so much. On the left, and for Pat and Robin, I can thank you for knowing a little bit more about this than I would have had we not hiked the remnants of the old roadbed. We have a Denver and Rio Grande passenger train just about to crest the summit of Parley's and duck into a tunnel on its way up to Park City. And Snow Park, though it was not complete, it would employ 70 people and be built out over the course of 1936. But the first snow carnival occurred on December 21st. Here we have two Union Pacific trains parked on the sidings over in Frog Valley by the Park City Consolidated Mine. You can see there's one engine and there's another engine. The demand far exceeded the initial expectations. 600 people signed up to ride the Denver and Rio Grande up to Park City to partake in the snow carnival, and 200 people joined from Park City. It was considered a rousing success. And thereafter, snow trains and snow carnivals would be a regular wintertime feature of Park City up until 1971. All right, World War II provides a temporary reprieve to Park City's commodity-related misery. Of course, the demand for the ores from here created a boom, so to speak, no pun intended, that would last the duration of the war and continue for several years afterwards as the military replenished their inventory. However, in 1949, misery returns. 900 miners lost their job that year. By the end of the year, there were just about 200 people working in the mines here from a high of 2,000 in the glory years. The decade of the 1950s was characterized by bitter and prolonged labor disputes, certainly for United Park City Mines, which was formed in the early 50s as the mines, I don't want to say collapsed, but they were consolidated under one holding company. And to add insult to injury, in a 1951 edition of Ghost Towns of the West, Park City was listed in there, despite the fact that 1,500 people still proudly called the town home. Okay, Jack Galvin, amazing gentleman. He was on the board of United Park City Mines. He was born in Park City in 1915 to Dan and Francis Galvin. His father was locally famous. In 1905, during the greatest mining disaster in Park City's history at the Daly West Mine, Dan Galvin was one of the first responders. He would go underground 4 times, risking his life to save 12 miners before he was finally overcome by the noxious fumes. He would survive. Tragedy struck the family in 1920 when Francis died from surgery. And it was decided at the time that Jack would be raised by his aunt, Miss Jeannie Kearns, the widow of Thomas Kearns, founder of the Silver King Coalition Mine, founder of the Salt Lake Tribune, and former Utah senator. And thus, though he was from Park City, by the time he was 6 years old, he's living in what's now the governor's mansion, which was the Kearns mansion down in Salt Lake City. In 1937, he goes to work for the Salt Lake Tribune and would have a brilliant career there. Though he's passed away a long time ago, I've met people who've worked with him and knew him. He's described as humble, brilliant, a visionary. He was a publisher, of course. He was media savvy, and he was the ultimate politician by not being a politician. He could move seamlessly amongst faiths. He was a devout Roman Catholic, and he moved seamlessly between the Democratic and Republican Party. So he succeeded by being the ultimate facilitator and building alliances. He was also on the board of United Park City Mines. Next. John Kennedy, our second president here. In 1959, in preparation for his 1960 presidential campaign, then the junior senator from Massachusetts visited Utah, and Jack Galvin would be his host. They developed almost an instant friendship based upon their faith and similarities. Kennedy had been a journalist. After he fulfilled his military obligation of World War II, he went to work for the Hearst newspapers as a reporter before he became a congressman in 1946. And as most of you know, he was a Pulitzer Prize winning author, having written the book, Profiles in Courage. Anyway, the two developed a fast friendship, and oh, another little tidbit, they both like Jack Daniels. So Jack Galvin becomes kind of a de facto advisor to Kennedy for his campaign as it relates to Utah, and also from a media standpoint. Again, Jack Galvin was very media savvy, including broadcast, radio, and print. And I'm going to turn it over to Stu for this part, because Stu's in one of these pictures.
Hello. Hi. So I'm giving Dave a chance to take a breath and have some water maybe, but when Dave was rehearsing this, he deserves 99.99% of the credit for what's happened here today. But I said, it seems like you're spending too much time on the 1960 election. And he scolded me for a little while, and I learned why this was so important. So in doing the research, and the picture on the left, I said, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. I am at this event that was pictured here. This is a little Cross, Wisconsin airport. I grew up about 60 miles from here. My mom and dad were disciples of John Kennedy. I was pressed against a fence right behind the camera platform. If John Kennedy wasn't standing there, you'd see my smiling face sitting there. An NBC cameraman grabbed me from my dad, lifted me up over the fence, and I sat on the platform underneath the camera as Kennedy spoke that day. And I was only 5 years old, so it's a pretty long way to remember, but it was talked about in the family a lot, so I feel like I remember it well. So this campaign really, if you think about it, it's super pivotal in the creation of skiing and resorts in Utah. So I see why David wanted to spend so much time here. This race had pitted Nixon against Kennedy. Nixon was the vice president under Eisenhower for 8 years. And Kennedy was this youthful, up-and-coming politician who was really making a name for himself. In the primaries, this young, youthful John Kennedy beat Lyndon Baines Johnson and Hubert Humphrey pretty easily overall. And so he emerged the candidate. And when the head-to-head polling started, Nixon was ahead by about 3 or 4 points. And as time went on, that lead was pretty solid, a little bit up and down, a little bit of seesaw for both of them. But then the very historic debates of 1960, the very first television debates occurred, and that kind of changed everything. So in September 26th of 1960, 70 million people watched, which is about 10 times more than the best show on TV right now. So that it had an audience of 10x based on that. It's not a Super Bowl audience, but at the time it was a pretty big audience. So these people watched Kennedy look into the camera, being charismatic. He was tanned, he looked good, he had makeup on. And Nixon, on the other hand, looked unshaven. He was sweating, he was nervous. And instead of looking at the camera, he was looking at the reporters who were to the left of the camera. And right after the debate had happened, the pundit said, well, on substance, Nixon really held his own against Kennedy, but the visual aspect of Kennedy on screen, it went from a 3-point negative to a 3-point positive, a 6-point swing overnight. So as time went on, they had a very aggressive debate schedule with 4 debates in a month. I think it would be exhausting to have to prepare for something like that. But throughout all of that, Kennedy kind of held that lead. And as October waned and November began, it shrunk just a little bit. So on election day, it was a complete photo finish. What's interesting about this election, Nixon, the Republican, carried California. Kennedy, the Democrat, carried Texas, based on the fact that he made peace with LBJ, and LBJ delivered Texas for him, which probably swayed the entire election at the time. We're used to hearing about close elections right now. 0.2 of a percentage point was the difference, and about 117,000 votes. So that's as close as it can get. And that is the pivotal point for Park City, because we're pretty sure, we don't know absolutely, but we're guessing that Jack Gallivan was one of the very first people to congratulate John Kennedy that day.
Okay. Part of Kennedy's campaign pledge was to create an organization called the Area Redevelopment Administration, kind of a modern day version of the WPA. And it was to invest in chronically depressed areas, economically depressed areas, and to create private-public partnerships. In 1962, February of 1962, United Park City Mines applied for an ARA loan of $1.2 million. Their plan was to build a ski resort in Park City, and they would match that $1.2 million. A dear sum, if that's the right term, for a struggling mining company. And they certainly qualified. And coincidentally, in August of 1862, a press luncheon was organized at the White House for a luncheon was organized at the White House for publishers from Utah. Jack Galvin helped organize that. And as the luncheon was winding down, Kennedy, then President Kennedy, and Jack Galvin had a private moment. And President Kennedy asked his good friend, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And Jack Galvin, without hesitation, said, "Oh, by the way, in February, we applied for a loan to the ARA, and we've heard nothing from them since then. And I'd really appreciate it if you'd look into it." Without hesitation, Kennedy turned to his press secretary, Pierre Salinger, and said, "Pierre, make it happen." 2 weeks later, the $1.2 million loan was approved, and there was joy and jubilation in Park City. Ground, coincidentally, for what would be called the Treasure Mountains Resort was, they began development just as it happened in Sun Valley in May of '63. And the resort would open on December 21st, 1963, the same date as the resort Sun Valley opened in 1936. The purpose of the ARA was to provide employment opportunities for underemployed or unemployed workers. Basically, the employees of United Park City Mines built Treasure Mountains, and they would work at Treasure Mountains. And they built it, including the famous gondola, in that when it opened, it was the longest gondola in North America. And the rest is history. So anyway, Diane, how are we doing on time? We're right there, huh? So anyway, questions, complaints, suggestions, we have a few moments, but this is what we learned. And Stu and I, despite my little joking before, we had a lot of fun working together. And, I got to meet people, vicariously that I'd never met or never knew. And getting back to Steve Hannigan, in 1920, he was asked by a journalist friend of his to attend a dinner for it wasn't secret at the time, organization. And it was at a bar in Greenwich, Connecticut. And it was so loud that Steve Hannigan was just like, you got to be kidding me. And they sketched the people that were there. The people that were at that dinner that night were flyers from World War I, US flyers. And they ultimately created an organization called Quiet Birdmen. And the name for that organization came from Steve Hannigan, because the loudness and partying that went on at the dinner, he goes, well, we'll just call them Quiet. So the Quiet Birdmen, they exist today, and they are the largest secret fraternal organization, quiet organization in the United States. So a little bit of trivia on that, and thank you so much. Oh, yeah, sorry, Sally.
I just wondered why they used the Union Pacific train when it had to go through Ogden from Salt Lake City and come the long way around instead of the Denver Rio Grande for the Hootspies that came into Stuart.
A couple things on that, Sally. Good question, by the way, of course. The Denver and Rio Grande served Park City until 1947, and then the rails were taken up. Thereafter, the ski trains, instead of a 2-hour trip, it was a 4-hour trip, because you had to go from Salt Lake City up to Ogden and Ogden to here. And though we talked about the Denver and Rio Grande being the first railroad company to bring people to the Snow Carnival, there were other events that were just specifically associated with Ogden, where the Ogden Chamber of Commerce, in collaboration with the Park City Chamber of Commerce, would organize their own events, primarily for the residents of Ogden. And the ski trains that or snow trains that you know of the 1960s up until 1971, there was no choice, because it was only the Union Pacific Railroad. And as you know better than I do, when Utah was advocating that they be selected for the '68 Olympics, Winter Olympics, they wanted to showcase the fact that they had transportation options. So the Union Pacific Railroad, in pursuit of that, because they started applying, I think in '64, ran a ski train every year here. They were primarily known as booze cruises or booze trains, because passenger service was regulated by the federal government, not by the local government. There was no restrictions on measured pours or anything like that. So having talked to a person who rode that train twice and others who greeted it here, most times people were pretty well inebriated by the time they got here. And they would stumble off the train, continue their drinking, and then stumble back. And on more than one occasion, they missed the train. And Faye Dearden, the Union Pacific station manager, would have to enlist the services, transportation services, of one of his 2 sons or his daughter to drive these drunk people to try to catch up with the train in Echo, Utah. So anyway, that's just a little side note, sorry. Yes?
The difference in time from before and after the railroad, 6 days to 180 days. What about the financial difference?
I don't have an answer for you on that, except it was much cheaper than that. And I will also add, despite the success of this, in addition to the success of the Sun Valley Resort, in the first 6 months that the resort was open, Union Pacific's passenger revenue increased by $250,000. So for Averell Harriman, his 2-pronged approach to stem the loss of passenger traffic, worked. And Union Pacific will continue to own Sun Valley until 1964 when they sold it. But I apologize, I don't have an answer to you for that. Yes, please.
Questions related to sort of this parallel path. The first one is short. If the Count was so familiar with the European skiing, were there not ski lifts there in the technology that they could have just brought over here instead of having the banana delivery development going?
No,
They don't have ski.
they did not have ski lifts,
Okay.
chairlifts as we know them. They had rope tows, but they did not have chairlifts. And it was just expected that if you wanted to ski, you were going to hike up.
And then my second question is, I know from about the same time, Walt Disney in California was working on Sugar Bowl, which is in Tahoe, and they opened in 1936. And a big reason he did that was for the Hollywood elite to come up from LA and get into Tahoe. Was that just sort of on a parallel path, or was there common knowledge between what they were doing in Sun Valley with the Hollywood glamour thing, or were they just in two parallel worlds?
I believe they had to have coexisted at the time, but some of the things that are just remarkable. First of all, Steve Hannigan, a lot of the celebrities that first came here, their whole trip was comped as a way to get them to come here. And so again, money was spent freely. And again, for Averell Harriman, he didn't care what it cost. He wanted the best. And yes, social media posts. That's right, Stu Meister. But from Los Angeles, they ran what would be called a limited train from LA directly to Sun Valley. It would come to Salt Lake City, and it was called the Snowball Express. And to inaugurate the opening of Sun Valley on December 21st, 1936, Averell Harriman, or the Union Pacific Railroad, launched two modern streamliners. One was called the City of Los Angeles and would go from New York City and stopping in Shoshone in 2 days and 16 hours, which was considered wow. And then they also had the train going from Los Angeles to Sun Valley via Salt Lake City. So I love that you brought up about Walt Disney's thing. I need to look into that, but thank you for that. Yes, sir.
Question related to our rail trail, which was inspired by Sun Valley's rail trail. And here the suggestion has been thrown out to make the rail trail again a railway corridor to relieve congestion on the roadways. In Sun Valley, has anybody ever made that suggestion for the old rail trail corridor in that area? To bring the railroad back.
I'm going to answer your question and try to, and I'm going to look at Sally Elliott as I'm answering it. The distance from Shoshone to Ketchum is 78 miles. From Echo, Utah to here is 27 miles. The Union Pacific abandoned their rails here, and the last train ran in August of 1988. And for Ketchum, Idaho, it was the summer of 1987. And in both cases, they were converted to rail trails. Sally played an instrument role, as we all know, in preserving the rail trail here. Unfortunately for the trail in Idaho, it's not really contiguous anymore. It's been developed and chopped up. So I was reading or trying to do some research on it. It comprises about 34 miles that's left of it, but it's all chopped up. So that would not be practical. And here, there is a lot of debate in the country. I don't know whether this was rail banked or what the term is, but there are other parts of the country where rails were converted to recreational trails. And now there's a legal fight in some areas to get them back to being, rail trails.
Ours is rail banked, but was the Wood River Trail part of Averell Harriman's Union Pacific?
Yes, it was. And just one thing I want to add about, thank you for reminding me. Jim Hewittson's father, the gentleman I mentioned before, worked for the Oregon Short Line. The Oregon Short Line was a wholly owned subsidiary of Union Pacific as it is today. And I had lunch with Keith in November of last year, and I had lunch with Jim in December. And I was really getting kind of like, I was fascinated by the count, like, holy shit, this Nazi guy. And look what he did. And he died. But Jim Hewitson said to me very innocently, he goes, the count came to Park City. And I'm like, no, I had no idea. I said, how do you know that? And he said, my father told me, because my father knew people still who worked at the Oregon Short Line and mentioned that, and Jim didn't have details, but he clearly remembered his father saying the count came to Park City. And, so that led to a whole new bit of research, for me on that. So thank you, Sally, for reminding me of that. More questions? Yeah, go.
And it gets you to a point. But when David does these interviews, I think everybody in the community should be grateful to him because he's uncovered a lot of interesting stuff. And many times conversation will get you more places than Google will. And I think we owe Dave a great debt of gratitude.
Oh, you're so kind, Stu Meister, so kind. But anyway, that's a tale of two ski towns. We hope you enjoyed it. We had fun. I had fun, and thank you for coming out tonight. And we'll do something else in the future.
David, I wanted to